During the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was popular to gather unusual-looking individuals with extraordinary conditions or diseases and put them on display for the masses as a source of entertainment. These people have been referred to variously as human oddities, human curiosities, or more offensively, as freaks of nature. In this video, we will explore all of this and more. We begin by looking into the first quintuplets in history known to have survived infancy, who were then put on display as a tourist attraction by the government. The Dion quintuplets were born in the town of Callander in Ontario in Canada on the 28th of May 1934. Their parents, two French Canadians by the name of Oliver Edouard Dion and Elsie Dion, named the five Annette, Cécile, Émilie, Marie and Yvonne. Elsie Dion's pregnancy was unusual. If a mother was carrying quintuplets today, this would be noticed at some stage during the pregnancy through a scan. However, methods of doing so were not available at the time, particularly in rural Canada, though Elsie later noted that she did believe she was possibly carrying twins during her pregnancy. It is probable that there was a sixth child involved, as Elsie later noted that towards the end of her first trimester, she had suffered from severe cramps and had passed an abnormal object, which was a possible very underdeveloped sixth fetus. The five Dion girls were born prematurely, as is wholly typical for multiple births, particularly those involving 5 children. They were considerably underweight as a result and required extensive care in their first days and weeks of life to survive. But survive they did, making them the first set of quintuplets to ever be born and live through infancy. To get a sense of how the Dion quintuplets' lives developed in the 1930s and 1940s, we need to examine the phenomenon of quintuplets and multiple birth children more broadly. Twins occur naturally in about 1 out of every 250 pregnancies. Triplets occur in 1 out of every 10,000, while quadruplets only occur in 1 out of every 700,000 pregnancies. That figure rises to an enormous 1 out of every 55 million pregnancies when it comes to quintuplets. Thus, it isn't difficult to see why the Dion quintuplets were viewed as being so unique when they were born, and all 5 survived the first weeks of their lives. The birth of multiple children comes with an ever-increasing array of medical risks the greater the number of children involved. Of these, the foremost complication concerns the children being born either prematurely or so underweight that they do not survive. Stillbirths are much more common in multiple birth pregnancies. Moreover, these medical risks do not end at birth. There are a whole host of illnesses which can strike at multiple birth children in the early and adult years. For instance, all 4 of the Dion quadruplets who were born in the American Midwest in 1930, just a few years before the Dion quintuplets developed schizophrenia. Cerebral palsy is also much more common in multiple birth children. Given all these risk factors, it is unsurprising to learn that twins and triplets had the low survival rate prior to the medical revolution of the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, while the survival of quadruplets and quintuplets was unheard of. The first recorded set of quadruplets to survive through birth, infancy and childhood were the Gary quadruplets, who were born in Switzerland in 1880. The Dions were the first ever recorded instance of quintuplets surviving, and it was this which would cast them into public glare and make them famous from the very moment they were born. The Dion quintuplets immediately became a source of media interest in Canada and the US when they were born. This also quickly turned into a legal dispute. Within days of their birth, the girl's father, Oliver, was approached by the organisers of the Century of Progress International Exposition, which was being held in Chicago in 1933 and 1934. The fair was designed to celebrate the centenary of Chicago as a city, but it was also a major international event. The organisers now wished to display the Dion quintuplets as part of it. Unfortunately, Oliver Dion was persuaded to sign a contract, entering into an agreement with the fair organisers, on the advice of Dr. Alan Roy Defoe, the physician who had overseen the successful pregnancy. However, Oliver and Elzir quickly changed their minds, and Oliver attempted to revoke the contract by claiming that it was not legally valid as Elzir had not signed it. The fair organisers objected, and a legal dispute followed. It was in this context that Oliver decided to sign custody of the 5 girls over to the Red Cross in Canada as a means of protecting them from the fair organisers. He and Elzir also did not have the financial resources or indeed the knowledge necessary to know how to care for quintuplets. Despite this arrangement, the girls were still sent to Chicago and briefly displayed there, while in the immediate aftermath of this, the Canadian government passed the Dion Quintuplets Act, which made the 5 girls wards of the Canadian state. Oliver Dion was granted a seat on a board of individuals, including Dr. Defoe and the Canadian Minister of Welfare, David Crow, but he never really exercised his vote on this board, and the girls effectively ended up as wards of the state in the mid-1930s. The declared motives of the Canadian government in separating the Dion quintuplets from their biological family was to ensure that they were raised well, the argument being that Oliver and Elzir Dion, being possessed of limited resources and finding themselves in a position which was unique in human history, were ill-suited to do so. However, from the very beginning, the attitude of the Canadian government and the individuals appointed to look after the 5 girls was extremely exploitative. A hospital, named the Defoe Hospital and Nursery, after Dr. Defoe, was purpose-built for them to grow up in. This was surrounded by barbed wire fence and was effectively a theme park. The girls lived here surrounded by a large number of staff, with thousands of visitors arriving each day to view them. When the hospital opened for such viewings in 1936, the visitors burst through the front gates in an effort to be amongst the first to lay eyes on the Dion quintuplets. This was done with a viewing room where the girls were placed on observation behind a glass partition. Over the next 7 years, approximately 3 million people would come to view the Dions, with as many as 6,000 people filing through some days. This became an enormous money-making exercise for the Canadian government. People were charged to enter the hospital, and as a result, what became known as Quintland eventually generated over $50 million in entry fees. At its height, Quintland was exceeded in North America as a tourist site only by places like Niagara Falls and the field of Gettysburg, where the most pivotal battle of the American Civil War had taken place in 1863. Moreover, individuals such as Dr. Defoe profited enormously. He exploited his position to become one of the most famous physicians in the world, authoring several books promoting medical and food products such as Colgate, Quaker Oats and Lysol, and appearing frequently on the radio and the growing medium of television. Eventually, concerns were expressed about the overt exploitation of the children. Oliver Dion had also become determined to gain the release of his children, yet this should not be looked at as a wholly good-natured development. The girls' parents were just as capable of exploiting their children for financial reasons as the Canadian government and Dr. Defoe had been. However, the demands of Oliver and Elzir Dion could not be ignored, and after a major pressure campaign was mounted in the early 1940s, custody of the girls was restored to their parents in 1942. A large trust fund had been set up for the quintuplets when the Canadian government took custody of them in the 1930s. This had grown to be quite large, on the back of royalties from Quintland and other activities, notably the appearance of the girls in several films between 1936 and 1938. With money from the trust fund, a large 20-room mansion was built for the Dion family, into which they moved in 1943. Family life at what was christened the Big House proved difficult. The quintuplets had several other siblings. These included 5 older children born between 1926 and 1933, and 3 younger boys born between 1936 and 1946. However, with the quintet having nearly spent 10 years apart from their family, a distance had developed between them and the other Dions. Moreover, as the girls would learn in later years, the rest of the family was effectively living an extravagant life based on the proceeds from the girls' trust fund. To compound matters, there were accusations that Oliver Dion, their father, sexually abused them in the mid to late 1940s and early 1950s. The 5 sisters left their childhood home when they turned 18 years of age. They blamed their parents for much of what had occurred in their earlier years, though much of it was the fault of the heavy-handed behaviour of the Canadian government and the clear exploitation of the quintuplets. Unsurprisingly, the 5 girls maintained only limited contact with Oliver and Elsie Dion afterwards. Shortly after they emancipated themselves from their parents, 5 became 4. Emily determined to become a nun once she entered her adult years, but her first months in the convent at Sainte-Agathe-de-Mont in Quebec as a postulant or trainee were plagued by a series of illnesses, primarily involving seizures. On the 6th of August 1954, one of these was so bad that she suffocated to death in the course of it. She was just 20 years of age at the time of her passing. The only other of the 5 sisters to die at a young age was Marie. On the 27th of February 1970, when the Quins were 35, she passed away in Montreal from a blood clot on her brain. Yvonne, Cécile and Annette had not heard from her in several days and had called the police to investigate. They discovered her dead in bed in her apartment. Yvonne, Cécile and Annette went on to live long lives. Yvonne enjoyed a varied career afterwards, variously working as a nurse, sculptor and librarian. She never married and did not have children. Annette married and had 3 sons, while Cécile also married and had 5 children, including a pair of twins. Both Annette and Cécile's marriages eventually ended in divorce. Given their traumatic earlier years, the Dions had trust issues and problems forming lasting relationships beyond those with each other. Following these marriage breakdowns, the 3 ended up living together in a house in Montreal by the 1990s. Here they campaigned for justice for their mistreatment during their earlier years, successfully suing the state government of Ontario in 1998. The previous year, they had written to Kenny and Bobby McCoy, the parents of the first set of septuplets known to have survived, advising them to limit media scrutiny and intervention in their lives and those of their 7 new children. Yvonne died on the 23rd of June 2001 at a hospital in Montreal. She was 67 years of age and had undergone surgery for cancer a few days before her passing. Both Annette and Cécile are still alive today and were interviewed together on the occasion of their 87th birthday in late May 2021. The sisters' legacy is a curious one. They have been the subject of a great many films, television shows, books, and even a Three Stooges sketch. Many of these date to the 1930s and 1940s at the height of their fame, while in 2018, the birth of the quintuplets was acknowledged as an official National Historic Event in Canada. But it is a mixed legacy, given that the Dions were effectively mistreated and exploited by those who were appointed to look out for them in their childhood years. Next, we are going to 19th century USA, where one girl was born as a dipygus and would become a sideshow performer when she was just 13. Josephine Myrtle Corbin was born in Lincoln County in Tennessee on the 12th of May 1868. Her parents were William Corbin, a wounded Confederate soldier, and Nancy Corbin. Nancy's maiden name was Sullins, which was probably a derivative of the Irish O'Sullivan, and this may have been changed due to the prevailing anti-Irish sentiment at the time. Her parents were of humble origins, and in later years, owing to Josephine's medical anomaly, it was speculated that her parents were actually closely related, and perhaps that they were even brother and sister. However, there is no concrete evidence to suggest that this was the case, or that any form of inbreeding was responsible for Josephine's medical issues. Josephine's birth was apparently fairly normal, though it was immediately clear that there were unusual features to her anatomy. This led to medical reports and extensive records being produced in the first weeks of her life, principally by medical observers. Yet, the abnormalities aside, she was clearly not in any physical pain, and her mother, Nancy, did not present any major problems during conception. Nevertheless, it was evident soon after Josephine was born that she was suffering from a condition which is known today as dipygus, though at the time it was medically undiagnosed and unclear exactly what caused it. Dipygus is also known in Latin as Terescata didymum, while a crueler name for it in the past was monster twinned below. It is the most severe form of what is known as caudal duplication syndrome. This is defined as the association between malformations and duplications of the systems involving the gastrointestinal, reproductive and genitourinary neurotubes, and the appearance of defects therein. How common this is and the exact reasons for why this occurs are not fully known to this day, but it is widely understood that it is a very rare condition. A study of it which appeared in the Journal of the Indian Association of Pediatric Surgeons in 2014 speculated that there were just a handful of confirmed cases in the 19th and 20th centuries, of which Josephine was one of the very few. What this means in practical terms is that individuals who suffer from the condition have certain parts of the caudal region and neural tube around what we would typically call the pelvis duplicated in themselves. The term caudal duplication syndrome was only defined in 1993 in a medical context, so it was extremely unheard of when Josephine was born in Tennessee in 1868. In her particular instance, she was born with two pelvises, which presented side by side next to each other, below her waist. As a result, she also developed 4 legs, 2 from each pelvis. However, these were not of equal strength and girth. The 2 outer legs on the left and right developed as normal legs, which could carry her weight, but the inner 2 legs were much shorter and weaker and only had 3 toes. Thus, while Josephine was possessed of 4 legs and had some limited control over the 2 weaker inner legs, she relied on her stronger outer legs to walk, much the same as anyone else. Nevertheless, there was a general form of normality to which she presented herself in later years. For instance, photos of her from the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries indicate that she wore stockings and boots of a matching shape and design on all 4 feet and legs, albeit of a different size, as her inner feet were of a very small size by comparison with her outer feet and legs. An extra point to bear in mind when evaluating how an individual with dipygus develops is that this is generally developed from an embryo which would have otherwise separated into twins, but because of an unusual set of circumstances, developed into one individual. In fact, what we see in Josephine's condition was the tiny body of her twin, which only developed waist down and was malformed. Josephine's condition was considered exceptionally unusual in her own time, and as a consequence, she was widely discussed within the medical literature of Gilded Age America from the time of her birth. From the very start, this was far from politically correct, or ethically correct by today's standards. For instance, a pamphlet published in 1869, when she was just 1 year old, referred to her as a well-formed and fully developed female child, 1 year old, born in Lincoln County, Tennessee. She's the most remarkable freak of nature now living, and whose complex nature is creating more sensation among scientific men than any curiosity ever before known. This tendency continued throughout the subsequent decades, as Josephine's story was continued and followed extensively. For instance, a brief account of her which appeared in the American Journal of Obstetrics in 1888, when she was 20 years of age, referred to Josephine as a unique monstrosity. Writing a year later, Lewis Whaley, a physician writing for the British Medical Journal and several other medical journals and news outlets, was more sympathetic when he stated that she is about 5 feet high, has fair skin, blue eyes and curly hair, and is very intelligent. A stranger to see her in company would only think her unusually broad across her hips, and with a carriage usual to one with clubbed foot. I have known Mrs. B since she was a tiny child, as the four-legged girl, but never realised the perfect dual development of both external and internal genital organs until she became my patient in a case of pregnancy. What later was revealed to be unusual about Josephine's case was that, while she generally had intercourse in one of her pelvises, she became pregnant on the other side. She expressed some surprise at this unusual state of affairs, but it was later reported by Whaley that, although an abortion had to be carried out for medical reasons in the case of one of her pregnancies, she managed to carry the others through to full term. When Josephine was just 1 month old, her father began showing her to curious neighbours for a dime. This helped to provide for her impoverished family, and she soon made a living from her rare medical condition. She was born and grew up in an age when the idea of the quote-unquote sideshow or freak show was in its prime in America and Europe. Such terminology would be considered extremely politically incorrect today, but by the standards of the Gilded Age in America, it was deemed acceptable to put people into circuses and sideshows who had medical anomalies or peculiar appearances. Thus, shows like that of P.T. Barnum, or what eventually became the Barnum and Bailey Circus, and the Ringling Brothers Show, featured people with extreme forms of dwarfism or gigantism, and other rare medical conditions which were considered highly unusual at the time. Josephine was first hired into one of these shows in the early 1880s, when she was just 13 years of age. This was in part down to the nationwide publicity she gained after her father placed various ads in the newspaper. Somewhat cruelly, she was referred to as the four-legged girl from Texas. The reason this was Texas and not Tennessee was because her family had relocated to the Lone Star State from Tennessee by that time. Promotional pamphlets produced at the time described her as being gentle of disposition as the summer sunshine and as happy as the day is long, as though the expectation was that her genetic condition would have also rendered her brain psychologically disturbed. All of this aside, Josephine was an extremely successful and popular performer. At the height of her fame in the 1890s and 1900s, she was able to earn up to $450 a week, an enormous sum by the standards of the time, equivalent to around $15,000 today. Moreover, several other shows across the United States and in Europe began developing shows of what were alleged to be four-legged performers to include in their own sideshows, though most of these involved fake prosthetic legs. Despite her very unusual condition by the standards of the late 19th century, and the fact that it was not fully understood why she had ended up with Dipygus, Josephine was able to have a very normal family life. When she was 19 years of age, she married James Clinton Bicknell. Their wedding photos reveal a happy union and a young woman who, despite having what would otherwise be accounted as a deformity, was very happy on the day of their nuptials. Josephine became pregnant within a year of her and James's wedding, and it was this development which led to Dr. Lewis Whaley, who, as we saw earlier, provided one of the first depictions of her condition in the medical literature, to contact her. In 1887, he described how Josephine was suffering from pains in her left side, headaches, fever, and a decreased appetite on account of falling pregnant with 2 pelvises. In several articles published in various medical journals, he explained her condition, which he described as being highly unusual and which reignited an interest in her case in the late 19th century. Despite these difficulties, Josephine and James's subsequent pregnancies were successful, and they went on to have 4 daughters and 1 son together. Curiously enough, it was later recorded that, because Josephine had effectively 2 pelvises and parts of 2 reproductive systems, 3 of her children were born from one part of her and 2 from another. Each seemed to have been relatively healthy, and the general nature of her Dipygus did not impact on the vitality of her children. Despite her peculiar medical condition, Corbin lived a relatively lengthy life. She only eventually died in Cleburne, Texas on the 6th of May 1928 at 59 years of age. The cause of her death was a streptococcal skin infection, which would be easily treatable today, but which led to her death at the time owing to the lack of knowledge about the use of antibiotics. The effectiveness of penicillin, for instance, was only first discovered the year that she died. Shortly after her death, she was buried in a grave that was filled with concrete. This might seem like an excessive course of action, yet it was necessary at the time as there was legitimate concerns that Corbin's body would be exhumed and put on display. Thus, when her funeral had been completed, her family members held a vigil by her gravesite until such a time as the concrete had dried and they could be sure that she would not become the victim of a grave robber. Thus, her body was laid to rest peacefully, despite several offers by medical practitioners and private collectors to pay a hefty sum for her body. One recent commentary by the author of her article on thehumanmarvels.com noted that Marta was by all accounts an interesting subject and remarkable person. Some people might have referred to people such as her as medical anomalies and other less flattering phrases at the time, but I call them incredible, persevering, resourceful, and marvelous human beings. During the 19th century, sideshows were at their peak, and no one was more well known than P.T. Barnum. One of his most famous performers was Annie Jones Elliott, America's beloved bearded lady. Annie Jones Elliott was born as just Annie Jones on the 14th of July 1865 in Smith County in Virginia. Her parents, and anyone who saw her at this time, were immediately struck by her appearance, for Annie had been born with a good-sized moustache, already beginning to develop on her face, and some stubble around her chin, where a man would usually develop facial hair in later life. And as the weeks and months went by, this facial hair continued to expand. What could explain this? Annie was most likely suffering from hirsutism, or some closely related version of the condition. Hirsutism is a condition which results in excessive amounts of hair growing on various parts of the body. The condition is typically caused by an underlying endocrine imbalance of an adrenal, ovarian, or central kind. These imbalances can result in excessive testosterone being produced in the woman's system, and consequently, the growth of facial hair. Alternatively, Annie might have been suffering from hypertrichosis, a related condition which tends to produce intense hair growth in localized parts of the body. Moreover, hypertrichosis is more often congenital and present from the sufferer's birth, as was the case with Jones. Sufferers of hirsutism and hypertrichosis today have a range of treatment options available to them. However, these were not available to women such as Annie Jones, who suffered from irregular hair growth in the 19th century. As a result, bearded ladies were a more common sight in cities of the 19th century than they would be today. Moreover, in some particular instances, they were the centre of so-called freak shows in the United States and many European countries. There is a long history of bearded women and other people with odd appearances being considered sources of amazement and used as spectacles. For instance, during the 16th and 17th centuries, individuals with dwarfism and gigantism were often employed as spectacles at Europe's royal courts. Later, these spectacles at royal courts were adopted as the basis for the sideshows of the 19th century. These were effectively circuses featuring people who suffered from many different ailments, which rendered their appearances highly unusual. And by the time that Annie Jones was born in 1865, the bearded woman or bearded lady was a staple of such shows across America and in other countries such as Britain. In an age when the cause of conditions such as hirsutism and hypertrichosis was not understood, it is unsurprising to learn that Annie's parents were somewhat perturbed by their daughter's appearance. However, their dismay soon gave way to relief when an opportunity presented itself shortly after Annie's birth. When she was just a few months old, word reached P.T. Barnum about the infant girl who was already sporting a beard. Barnum was an American showman who had emerged in New York City in the 1830s as the director of Barnum's Grand Scientific and Musical Theatre. Thereafter, he branched out in the 1840s to running Scudder's American Museum, a venue which featured such oddities as General Tom Thumb, a dwarf who even in his adult years stood just over 3 foot tall, and Chang and Eng, a pair of Siamese twins who were extremely argumentative. Barnum was always on the lookout for a new attraction, and so, when he got word of Annie Jones's beard in infancy, he made contact with her parents. Eventually, Annie joined Barnum's New York-based exhibition when she was just 9 months old. Her parents, who were poor Virginians, agreed to allow this on the basis that Barnum would pay them a fee while Annie was in the show. Annie thus ended up in New York in 1866, where she was billed as Infant Esau. The name Esau was one which was regularly applied to individuals suffering from hirsutism in the 19th century, and is a reference to the biblical character Esau, who was a grandson of Abraham and brother of Jacob. Esau featured in the book of Genesis, where he was specifically noted for his hairiness at birth. The initial run in New York City generated a lot of attention, and Barnum subsequently reached a deal with Annie's parents that she would continue to feature in his shows and they would receive a fee of $150 per week for as long as she continued as part of the museum. This was a very considerable amount of money by the standards of the mid-19th century, and Annie's parents agreed. Initially, Annie's mother went to live with her in New York. However, within a few months, a family emergency of some kind appears to have required her to head back to Virginia, and Annie was placed under the charge of a nanny in the big city, one appointed by Barnum. It was during this period that Annie was very briefly kidnapped by a phrenologist, a proponent of a 19th century pseudoscience, which argued that intellectual development could be understood by studying the physical properties of somebody's head and torso. Luckily, however, Annie was soon recovered in upstate New York. The phrenologist was prosecuted, and Annie's mother returned to New York to oversee her care. In 1868, when Annie was 3 years old, the building which housed Scudder's American Museum burned down. As a result, P.T. Barnum decided to retire, a decision which briefly had implications for Annie. However, in just a short time, Barnum was tempted back into show business, and a new travelling show called P.T. Barnum's Great Travelling Museum, Menagerie, Caravan and Hippodrome was set up, though it is more commonly known today as the greatest show on earth. In the years that followed throughout the 1870s, Annie travelled across America with it, billed as Infant Esau, and then as she grew older, the bearded girl, the bearded lady, and finally, the bearded woman. Already by this time in the early 1870s, her moustache and beard had expanded to a full beard and sideburns. As she grew older and became aware of how it was that she was actually making her living, Annie also decided to grow out her hair to match the unusualness of her beard. Eventually, her hair grew to be 6 foot long, and she could hold large tranches of it in her own hands in her lap. Eventually, she gained such notoriety for being one of the most famed bearded ladies of the age that in the course of the 1870s, 1880s and 1890s, Annie Jones was photographed and featured in many magazines and posters across America and Europe. As the years went by, Annie continued to feature in Barnum's show. In 1880 or 1881, when she was still a teenager, Annie married for the first time. Her husband was one Richard Elliot, a member of the circus, not as a sideshow, but as a barker, someone who was hired to stand outside on the street and proclaim loudly about the wonders that were to be seen inside in order to draw passers-by in. Elliot was many years older than Annie, and her parents did not approve of the relationship, but the marriage went ahead in any event, and Annie Jones became Annie Jones Elliot. Despite her parents' disapproval, the marriage was also to last 15 years, before she and Elliot divorced in 1895. In the interim, P.T. Barnum died in 1891. He had only played a marginal role in the greatest show on earth for some years, as he was in his 70s during the 1880s, and the circus had largely been run in these years by James Anthony Bailey and his associates, with whom Barnum had joined in 1881. Thus, into the 1890s and up to her divorce, Annie was mainly dealing with Bailey following Barnum's death. The divorce in 1895 prompted a major sea change in Annie's life. She was now 30 years of age and had never known any life other than the circus. She wasn't about to change her profession, but she did begin to articulate concerns about the use of the term freak show to describe the kinds of travelling circuses that she had been around her entire life. In the years that followed, she campaigned extensively to try and convince individuals such as Bailey and the operators of other major circuses in America, such as the Ringling Brothers, to abandon the use of the word freak in their shows. It was also shortly after the breakdown of her first marriage and divorce that Annie married William Donovan, who, like Elliot, was a barker or talker who stood around outside to entice in customers. Annie had known Donovan since they were children, having grown up together in the circus, and her shifting relationship with him seems to have led directly to her divorcing Elliot. This prompted further changes, and shortly after, she and William Donovan were married. The newlywed couple then left the Bailey and Barnum circus and decided to go out on their own as a duo act. They wouldn't be as well known as the circus they had just left, but they had their own independence for some time, travelling not just in America, but also in Europe. Donovan died just 4 years into their marriage, and being robbed of her husband and business partner, Annie decided to return to familiar surroundings and rejoined the Bailey and Barnum circus in 1900. She continued her activism against the use of the word freak in sideshow circuses, but her activity in this regard was cut short just 2 years later. While visiting her mother in Brooklyn in 1902, she became ill. Her condition deteriorated rapidly from what was almost certainly an aggressive form of tuberculosis. When she died on the 22nd of October 1902, she was just 37 years of age. The so-called freak shows, which she had been a part of for her whole life, continued to be a feature of American and European circuses and shows for another 30 years. But from the 1920s, they gradually became less popular as our scientific understanding of issues like hirsutism improved and people became more sympathetic towards such abnormalities. For our next story, we are going to England, where one 19th century woman joined a sideshow as the so-called ugliest woman in the world, so that she could provide for her children. Mary Ann Bevan was born as Mary Ann Webster in Palestone, East London, on the 20th of December 1874. She was one of 8 children in a poor family. When she entered her adult years, she began training as a nurse, a profession which had boomed in the second half of the 19th century in Britain owing to reforms of the nursing practice, which Florence Nightingale had introduced in the 1850s and 1860s. Mary had completed her training by the late 1890s, and by 1900 was working as a nurse in London. Photos of her from this time reveal her to have been an attractive brunette. In 1903, Mary Ann married Thomas Bevan, a London greengrocer whom she had been seeing for some time. Thus, Mary Ann Webster became Mary Ann Bevan. They quickly started a family, and by the early 1910s they had 4 children. But then in 1914, Thomas died before his time, which was a severe blow to Mary Ann, both economically and of course emotionally. Thus, she would now have to raise their young family herself, and they were not very well off. What's more, around 1906 Mary Ann had begun suffering from a rare illness called acromegaly. Acromegaly is a disorder of the pituitary gland, the organ which regulates the production of hormones in human beings. The disease is caused by an overproduction of growth hormones. This is a limited problem in younger patients who are still growing, but once people reach their adult years, their growth plates start to close. If they develop acromegaly, the excessive production of growth hormones causes them to start growing again. But now the body's growth plates are largely sealed, and this results in abnormalities to their body, and the patient can suffer a lot of pain. In more than 95% of cases, the underlying cause of the disease is a benign tumour, having developed on the pituitary gland known as pituitary adenoma. It affects about 6 people out of every 100,000, and usually begins to occur in middle age. Symptoms of the disease typically start with the enlargement of feet and hands, and then progress to distortions and expansion of the face and other parts of the body, such as would occur with Mary Ann Bevan. Later, joint pain and headaches develop periodically, and the sufferer's voice will often deepen. There are treatments for acromegaly today. Surgery can be used to try and remove the tumour from the pituitary. However, because this requires brain surgery, medications and radiation therapy are the preferred frontline treatments. Unfortunately though, in Mary Ann Bevan's time, little was known about the disease, and there was no effective treatment of any kind available for it, so she had to soldier on, despite it starting to affect her daily life. Mary Ann had first begun exhibiting symptoms of the disease around 1906. As is common with the pituitary disorder, her hands and feet first appeared swollen, and then the physical damage caused by the disease got worse as the years went on. She appears to have quit her nursing job at some time in the late 1900s and early 1910s, as her facial features and other parts of her body became more out of joint. Thomas Bevan, who was devoted to his wife, seems not to have minded, and was happy for her to stay at home if it was what she preferred in responding to the onset of the condition. But when Thomas died in 1914, Mary Ann was left in a desperate situation, where she had to provide for her 4 young children, the youngest of which was still an infant. By this time, Mary Ann's face was becoming more and more drawn and masculine looking, and folds of skin were starting to droop under her eyes. Consequently, in the conditions of the time, her appearance was making her less and less employable as time went by. Thus, Mary Ann had to go between jobs in the years that followed her husband's death, but she was constantly struggling to make ends meet. Finally, in the late 1910s, she decided to try and capitalize financially on the manner in which the disease had devastated her body. At this time, she entered a competition to find the world's ugliest woman, which had been placed in a newspaper by one Claude Bartram, the European agent for the American circus Barnum and Bailey. Mary Ann sent in a photo which caught Bartram's attention. He contacted Bevan and offered her a job at the Barnum and Bailey circus in the United States. Mary Ann was initially reluctant, but eventually agreed to it when she was offered £10 a week for a year, in addition to having all of her travel expenses covered, and receive additional money from sales of any postcards of her at the circus. With this money, she would now be able to provide for her children's education. The Barnum and Bailey Circus was just one of many shows which were held across America and other countries in the 20th century, which today would be considered callous and entirely politically incorrect. These shows would feature individuals who were considered spectacles, usually owing to some abnormality or their being the victim of some genetic disorder or disease, as in the case of Mary Ann Bevan. For instance, such shows might feature giants and dwarfs who were respectively suffering from gigantism or dwarfism, or they could include conjoined twins and albinos, or individuals who had been born without a limb or were very large in girth. It was in shows like this that Mary Ann Bevan would perform for the next few years in America. In the beginning, her work involved a tour of Hampshire in England, but she was soon contacted by the head of the circus in America to come over to America. Accordingly, she set off from Southampton to America in 1920. There she discovered that she was actually working now for the Ringling Brothers Circus. The Ringling Brothers Circus had first been established in Wisconsin back in 1884 by the 5 Ringling Brothers, the sons of German immigrants to America. In 1919, shortly before Bevan's arrival in America, it merged with the Barnum and Bailey Circus. The combined operation began being advertised as the greatest show on earth. Thus, when she was featured in their show, Bevan was forming part of a world-famous circus of the early 20th century. She quickly gained some notoriety in the sideshows of America, featuring in several newspapers who described her as the ugliest woman in the world. Within a few months, Bevan was one of the stars of the show, and she even soon featured on the pages of Time magazine. This was compounded by the decision to dress her during the show in men's clothing or unattractive garments, in such a way as to make her seem more masculine and emphasize the damage which the disease inflicted on her. With this notoriety, the Ringling Brothers Circus made more money, and Bevan received a substantial portion of it. By 1923, she is said to have earned about £20,000 during her time in the United States, a figure equal to well in excess of £500,000 today. But one can only wonder what the emotional and psychological impact of being displayed as a human oddity at the circus night after night had on her during these years. Mary Ann returned to Europe in 1925 to take part in a show in Paris, but ultimately she took the decision to relocate her children to New York City. With the money she earned, she was able to send the 4 children to boarding school and for them to live in relative comfort. She continued to work periodically at the Coney Island Dreamland show in Brooklyn. In 1927, Bevan became a patient of Harvey Cushing, a distinguished American neurosurgeon and pathologist who pioneered brain surgery in the early 20th century. Cushing was unable to provide much by way of remedy for Bevan, but he did write a strongly worded letter to Time magazine in response to the piece it had recently published on Bevan. Here he stated that this unfortunate woman who sits in the sideshow of Ringling Brothers, between Fat Lady and Armless Wonder, and affects white lace hats, woolen mittens, and high lace shoes, has a story which is far from mirth-provoking. She was previously a vigorous and good-looking young woman, but has become the victim of a disease known as acromegaly. Being a physician, I do not like to feel that time can be frivolous over the tragedies of disease. Mary Ann Bevan eventually died in 1933. If treated today, acromegaly does not severely impact one's life expectancy, but in the early 20th century, sufferers would generally have their life expectancy reduced by 10 to 15 years. Such was the case with Mary Ann Bevan, who died on the 26th of December 1933, just a few days after her 59th birthday. Fortunately, her children fulfilled her dying wish and had her brought back to England to be laid to rest. She was buried at Brockley and Ladywell cemeteries in Lewisham, southeast London. It should be noted that her demise might have been accelerated by a considerable drinking problem in her later years, one which was no doubt exacerbated by her disease and the manner in which she was ridiculed on a nearly daily basis for years. Mary Ann Bevan's story has been periodically retold in the 80 years plus since her death. This is owing to both the notoriety which she briefly had in America in the 1920s, and also because her story is indicative of the rather callous attitude society had towards people with physical abnormalities as recently as the 1920s. Sometimes, Bevan reappears in popular culture in more distasteful ways. Back in the early 2000s, the major card manufacturer and stationery company, Hallmark, began selling a birthday card making fun of the world's ugliest woman. This featured a picture of Mary Ann Bevan and referenced a blind date show at the time, in which participants had to pick from 3 contestants that they could not see. The idea was meant to be that the participant chose door number 3, behind which Mary Ann Bevan was waiting. The birthday card was spotted on sale in London in 2006 by Dr. Wouter de Herder, a Dutch consultant endocrinologist at the Erasmus Medical Centre in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. De Herder was visiting the UK for work and had recently written a research paper which referenced Bevan's life and her struggles with acromegaly. He was appalled by the card and complained to Hallmark that, to quote, "I simply don't think it's right in 2006 to use her image to create a sick birthday card. I feel that this card is insulting to all patients who suffer from the same condition." Hallmark reluctantly accepted it was wrong for them to make a sick woman the butt of a joke, but they only stopped further production and refused to take any cards which had already been produced out of circulation. As Robert Knutson, the Chief Executive Officer of the Pituitary Network Association, a group which focuses on supporting people with pituitary-related diseases such as acromegaly, subsequently commented, "To make money from the misery and misfortune of others is shameful. This is corporate greed taken to its lowest level." Hence, Mary Ann Bevan was a woman who, despite all her hardships, managed to make the most of her situation, even though at her own expense. She earned money and gave her children a brighter future and more opportunities than she received in her youth. For our final tale, we are staying in England and are looking into the sad life of the Elephant Man. Joseph Merrick, or the Elephant Man, as he was known by many, lived a life of misery due to a physical deformity that left his skin lumpy and misshapen. He was rejected by loved ones and viewed as a freak by others for conditions that were no fault of his own. Behind the circus performances and scientific experiments was a man of great character, someone desperate to fit in a world that was determined to shut him out. He was born on the 5th of August 1862 in Leicester, England, to parents Joseph and Mary Jane Merrick. We aren't certain when exactly baby Joseph began developing abnormally, but it was noted at the age of 5 that there was a considerable difference in the sizes of his arms. At around the age of 21 months, his parents began to notice swollen lips and bony growths on his face, the roughening of his skin. In addition to this, he injured his hip, which left him with a rather serious limp. It was believed by Joseph's parents, and the Joseph himself, that his deformities originated because of maternal impression. The idea that physical or emotional experiences of a mother could have a physical impact on her unborn child. Mary Jane had been frightened by a circus elephant while pregnant with her son. She believed that it was this fear that had caused her son's rough elephant skin. Despite the growing deformities, Joseph's mother loved him fiercely. It did not seem to matter to her. She treated him as she treated Joseph's brother and sister. Losing his mother to bronchopneumonia, a subtype of pneumonia, at the age of 11 was a serious blow to the young boy. Without her there, he'd lost the only person in the world who'd loved him completely and unconditionally. Joseph Sr. remarried, not long after his wife's death. His new bride and Joseph Sr. himself rejected the young boy. He lived a life of misery within that home, causing him to run away numerous times. Joseph's formal education ended at the age of 13, which was the typical age for someone of his background. He went to work in a cigar factory where he remained employed for a few years until the deformities of his hands made it impossible to roll the cigars properly. After being forced to leave the cigar factory, he searched and searched for a job, but it was difficult for him. He was unemployed and constantly reminded of the financial burden he was for his family. Eventually, his father helped him obtain a hawker's license, which would allow him to become a door-to-door salesman. He made a few sales for a local haberdashery, but he was overall unsuccessful as his deformities, including difficulties speaking, made people wary of him. No one wanted to open the door for him, let alone give him their money. One day, at the age of 15, he was beaten by his father for not earning enough money. After that, Joseph left home and did not return. He lived alone on the streets until his uncle, a barber named Charles, took him in. While living with his uncle, Joseph continued to try to make sales, but he was met with as much success as before. Things got so bad for him that his license was withdrawn and he was no longer allowed to sell. At the age of 17, Charles could no longer afford to let Joseph live in his home. Joseph had no choice but to enter a workhouse. A 19th century workhouse was a place where those who could not support themselves financially could live and find employment. He did not seem to like the workhouse though, as he checked himself out after only living there for 12 weeks. However, he was still unable to find work and was forced to return to the workhouse for years. While living in the workhouse, Joseph had surgery on his face to try and remove some of the skin around his mouth, as it was becoming increasingly difficult to speak and eat. It soon became apparent that a conventional line of work wasn't an option for Joseph in the way he wanted it to. His deformities made everything the workhouse tossed his way nearly impossible. After this realization, he turned to a career in human novelty exhibition. Freak shows had come about during the 17th century in England, but reached the height of their popularity as pastimes in the 19th century. At the age of 22, Joseph contacted a well-known showman, Sam Torr, and asked to be an exhibit in his show. Sam was able to set Joseph up with a group of men who were able to manage Joseph's career as a human exhibit. It was at this time that he was given his stage name, the Elephant Man. He was put on display in a travelling show that moved through the East Midlands, Leicester, Nottingham, and then London. After his near immediate success, Tom Norman, a man who owned a penny gaff shop, which was a type of theatrical show that provided short, entertaining shows for the lower classes in the East End of London, signed him on to perform for him. While Norman initially feared that Joseph's deformities were too frightening for the average Londoner, upon meeting the young man for the first time, he soon learned that people were incredibly curious. Joseph was given an iron bed and curtain in one of the back of Norman's shops to live when he wasn't performing. It was there that Norman became even more curious, sticking around to watch Joseph sleep one evening. When he learned that he was forced to sleep sitting up, with his head resting upon his knees, to avoid suffocation or injuring his neck, ideas began to form in the shop owner's mind. He used many degrading posters of monster-human hybrids to sell the idea of Joseph being a monster. He made advertisements and distributed pamphlets titled The Autobiography of Joseph Carey Merrick, which may or may not have been written by Joseph himself. It told his life story, which was used, as well as his physical appearance, to sell tickets. Before each show, Norman would step on stage and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce Mr. Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. Before doing so, I ask you please to prepare yourselves. Brace yourselves up to witness one who is probably the most remarkable human being ever to draw the breath of life." Joseph's show took place in Norman's shop, which was located across the street from London Hospital. Medical students were known for crossing the street to study Joseph during his shows because they were fascinated by his condition. A surgeon named Reginald Tuckett was another medical professional who found himself interested in Joseph's life and condition. He told his boss, Frederick Treves, who set up a private viewing of Joseph before the shop opened one day. He described him as the most disgusting specimen of humanity that I had ever seen. At no time had I met with such a degraded or perverted version of a human being as this lone figure displayed. After the meeting, Treves went back to work and then sent Tuckett back to the shop to ask Joseph and Norman if it were possible to examine Joseph at their hospital. Both men agreed, and Joseph donned his large coat and face covering so as to not cause a scene in the streets. When he arrived for his examination, Treves was surprised by Joseph's intelligence. He was expecting an imbecile. He took in physical characteristics, noting Joseph's head circumference at 36 inches, his right wrist at 12 inches, and that one of his fingers measured 5 inches in circumference. Treves also made note of the warty growths on his skin, as well as the fact that the larger growth had an unpleasant odour to it. His hypodermis was weak and loose, almost hanging from his body. His hip had only worsened over time, the limp becoming even more prominent. During this examination and the subsequent examinations, he was poked and prodded until he just could not take it anymore. He told Norman that he did not want to go back. He continued to work with Norman, performing in shows until those types of shows fell out of favour. They were losing popularity, and authorities were working to shut them down. They decided to move their shows to continental Europe, where there was a lack of success due to the same problems. The shows were just not popular anymore. Sadly, Joseph was then abandoned in Brussels by his new manager. He later made his way back to London, where he found himself penniless, with nowhere to go. He could not work and had no family to go home to. When strangers tried to help him, they could not understand him due to his unintelligible speech. Eventually, Treves' calling card was found on Joseph, and Treves was contacted to help him. Treves took him back to London Hospital, where it became apparent that Joseph's condition had worsened since they last met. Along with the worsening of his chronic conditions, Joseph had contracted bronchitis as well. After being nursed back to health, he was given a room in the attic. While the initial meetings with Treves, back when Joseph was working with Norman, were not necessarily positive, the two seemed to become friends after Joseph began residing in the hospital. Treves and the hospital staff cared for Joseph, viewing him as more than the deformed freak he'd been living as for years. They helped him to bathe regularly in an attempt to control the odour that was coming from his skin, and Treves was able to slightly understand Joseph's speech when nearly everyone else could not. Despite the fact that he was cared for, after about 5 months, it was clear that Joseph could not stay at London Hospital. They were simply not equipped to handle Joseph's unknown, incurable diseases. Treves reached out to other doctors, even releasing pieces in the Times asking for help. Eventually, money was raised for Joseph to stay at London Hospital, but they were not able to help him medically. The hospital, however, was able to give Joseph a home. Treves visited him every Sunday. It meant the world to Joseph to have someone who understood him. The two would speak for hours, Joseph asking all kinds of questions about life and the world he'd never been able to explore properly. Furthermore, Treves helped Joseph meet new people, bringing him home to meet his wife, and bringing friends to the hospital to speak with him. When Treves became aware that Joseph had never really known a woman other than his mother, he realized that Joseph's ideas of women were dominated by the views of his mother, whom he adored and carried a photo of with him. He set out to introduce Joseph to his friend, Mrs. Layla Maturin. She was a young widow who agreed to speak with Joseph. She'd been kind, but the meeting was short. Joseph was overwhelmed, later stating that Layla was the first woman to ever smile at him. London Hospital was good for Joseph. His meeting with Layla and conversations with Treves had helped his confidence. His story intrigued people, which had upper-class citizens with a good deal of money donating towards Joseph's life, allowing him to accomplish lifelong dreams of experiencing the theatre and speaking with members of high society. In fact, Joseph once met the Prince and Princess of Wales, later King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. A signed photo from the princess became his prized possession. He was able to take short trips, visiting the countryside and discreetly riding trains. While he was living the best years of his life at London Hospital, those 4 years would also be his last. His health continued to deteriorate until April 12, 1890, when Treves found Joseph dead in his bed at the age of 27. It appeared as though Joseph, in his constant desire to understand what a normal human's life was like, had gone asleep while lying down. The size of his head had caused him to suffocate. Treves dissected him, saving grafts of skin that were eventually lost during the Second World War. He mounted his skeleton, which still remains in the pathology collection of the Royal London Hospital, where it is studied by medical students, but not on public display. Medical professionals have been studying Joseph and then his body for over a century. Conditions such as pachydermatosal and von Recklinghausen disease have all been proposed and disproven. To this day, Joseph Merrick's medical condition and the cause of his anguish remains unknown. A poem that Joseph Merrick used in his sideshow pamphlet was the following: "'Tis true, my form is something odd, but blaming me is blaming God. Could I create myself anew, I would not fail in pleasing you. If I could reach from pole to pole, or grasp the ocean with a span, I would be measured by the soul, the mind standard of the man." His life has been the subject of many books, TV shows, and films, perhaps most famously, the 1980 film, The Elephant Man. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on these various so-called human curiosities or oddities. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the lives down below in the comments, and if you want more long videos like this, also be sure to let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.